Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself. Feeling ready to kick your sales into high gear? We're here to help. Check out our sales coaching and consulting services at predictablerevenue.com. Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Collin Stewart. Today, I'm joined by Lily Youn and Hayes Davis at Gradient Works, and we're going to talk about territory design. Lily, Hayes, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
I'm excited to have you both on. For context, for those listening, we've got, I've been trying to optimize the show for a mix of founders that are learning revenue for the first time and sales leaders. And because personally, that's kind of the weird little Venn diagram I sit in. And I'm always excited to learn something new, especially as we were talking about in the pre-show, something they don't necessarily teach in university. You know, sales is not something that's taught in university. And if you're not into sales, there's no way you're going to take a territory design course. So there isn't a lot of content out there. And so it usually comes down to a couple of random things. And I've known the lucky reps and the unlucky reps that got hurt or rich off of bad territory design. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. Lily, you're the head of growth. Hayes, you're the co-founder and CEO. Well, again, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Excited to be on this call.
Hi, me too. I'm curious the story. Hayes, can we start with how you why you decided, you know what, I want to dedicate my life to territory design? There's got to be a really bad comp story in there somewhere.
You know, it's not so much a comp story. I kind of came from this out of left field. If you had asked me 10 years ago that what am I going to be doing with my life? Working on a company, building a company around territory and territory design, I would have said you were crazy. And it probably still is crazy. But the reason I got here is I was a technical founder in my first startup. I was a software engineer, very much believed that if we build it, they will come. And that company, we had a really strong product-led growth motion. It was really before people really talked about PLG a lot. But the thing I always struggled with and was just such a big challenge was growing and building the sales team so that we could get to that next step, not just kind of the folks coming in and buying something, for $20 a month, but how can we actually drive larger deals? And we just never got it right. But we got fortunate enough to be acquired into a company that had a large sales team, and it was like just having a new toy. It was so exciting. We were brought in. We had our product. It was a really great opportunity for attachment and getting into their sales organization. And so I just dove in with both feet and said, how do we get these sellers to really want to sell our product and have it be part of what we do? And this was a fast growing growth stage startup, and it was just a lot of fun. And I started to realize my technical mind that these large sales organizations are really these kind of big distributed systems, if you will, that you have to figure out how to optimize. That's a very technical thing, but it's something that maybe will resonate with technical founders. And I just started to love it because it was a combination of operationalization plus people, and people are so much more interesting than computers. They have all sorts of different failure and success modes that are different than computers. But from that company, which Lily and I actually worked at, got acquired by our largest competitor. And that competitor was publicly traded, had 4,000 people, 600 sellers. And I had I'd shown kind of an operational capability plus a high pain threshold. And so I ended up as SVP of revenue operations there, and inherited a team of about 50 people. And my primary goal was, how do we make those sellers successful? And we were public, but PE backed. So it was the best-ish of both worlds, right? So it was all about EBITDA and efficiency. It was actually very painful. But that aside, whatever those 600 sellers weren't attaining, and they worked in many cases when we got there, it's a huge deal for the company. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, how are we enabling those sellers? What are we doing around data to make sure we have phone numbers and firmographics? What are we doing around, the ability to actually dial and email and do all of those things. We were investing heavily in all of those areas. We had, $100,000, $200,000 contracts with a bunch of vendors and all of that. But what it actually came down to was we weren't deploying those folks into the market correctly. We didn't have the right people working the right accounts. And that was where a lot of this was coming from. And so I started diving into territory, went through some painful territory redesign processes there. But we ended up adopting a more dynamic model, which got really fascinating for me because we started to see efficiency gains. And so I started digging into it further. And largely we've been doing territories the same way for the last 100 plus years. There's actually a book from 1919 I like to bring out called Modern Sales Management. And one of the things they complain about in that book is that maybe organizing your team by state lines doesn't actually make a lot of sense, right? So there's already this complaint about geographic territories and cars and stuff in 1919. And fast forward to today, 100 years later, I think a lot of people who are listening to this, if you've ever carried a bag, will probably have some of those same complaints. And, post-COVID, post-ZERP, all of these things, we're in a world where we got to drive efficiency, and it doesn't really matter that much exactly where we're located. You could put your field service rep or your field rep right beside the HQ of your biggest, best prospects, and their buying committee is still in 6 different states. All right. So, you're not really gaining as much through some of the traditional approaches. And so I just got really fascinated with this problem. And here I am confusing my younger self about why in the world I would be devoting my time to this problem. But it's a fascinating one that I love.
I feel like we could do a whole episode on technical co-founder to head of revenue.
Yes, we probably could. I've made a ton of mistakes and learned a lot, hopefully reducing some of the mistakes I'm making right now.
And no alien abductions in the middle, just
not that I remember. So that's the thing, is you never are sure. Right.
They probably had the little flashy thing. We're going to quote old Will Smith movies.
Yeah.
Nice.
Lily, I want to bring you into the journey because you've been with Hayes for a while now. In terms of you guys have worked together. I'd love to understand your perspective, previous company. When did you start thinking about territory design in your previous company?
Yeah. In my previous company, I started thinking about territory design more when 2 things happened. I actually took over the outbound SDR function and also ended up managing a lot of the SDR's books. And so that's when it really clicked for me that it can make a huge difference in how reps are actually producing and the impact on their efficiency. So that was the one thing. And the other thing was, as a seller myself, my entire career, I've actually been a part of different territory designs at each of my organizations. So I've done a geographic model, sold in that model, also done the Wild West model, and had those static motions, and also have done this dynamic model. And each of those scenarios, I think I've learned from a personal seller standpoint, the pain points of a static model and how that impacts my own attainment and outcomes. But also from a perspective of once you're in leadership, how does this impact the entire team, but then also the company in the end as well. So that's how I started really realizing how territories can make an impact, was that connection of I have a big team of 50 reps that I am responsible for. How am I going to make sure that they hit their number? We can throw all the sales enablement solution and tech out them and training. But if the core problem is what they're working, which is the accounts, then we need to solve that. And so that's how I ended up actually getting really into the whole territory design process.
It's interesting because I think a lot of sales leaders don't think about how we focus our reps, right? If you, everything I've learned about being a CEO and being a founder, and I probably only learned 4% of what I've needed to. And I'm still working on the other 93%, including my math skills. but everything is, it's rocks, it's OKRs, it's how do we structure, how do we organize? And all of this work goes into how do we focus the organization on working on the top 1 to 2, maybe 3 priorities. And it always, looking back into revenue, it does feel like we're going back into the Stone Ages because we spend all this time and investment in, okay, as a company, this is what we're going to focus on. And a go-to-market is a very large part, if not the largest part of a company's success or failure when they're trying to grow a company. And yet when it comes to the design of who are we going to have our SDRs, our AEs, our, account managers, how are we going to focus their time and attention? People are like, just use a spreadsheet, or I don't know, just, look on LinkedIn. Like it feels very, it just kind of clicked for me just as you were describing it. It feels so haphazard thinking backwards about it.
I think one of the things that happens is that there's a phase change in organizations where it goes from haphazard to, I would actually argue, overly structured. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of interesting here is, and so let me explain that. One of the things that happens in the early days, right? So if you're a founder and you're just starting to have multiple sales reps, which means you're just starting to think about how do I focus their attention in particular areas. You want to start just sort of doing a simple process. Like, let me just make sure people aren't stepping on each other's toes and that sort of thing. And then that simple process kind of gets gnarlier and gnarlier as you don't really pay attention to it, right? So you hire some more reps, and then suddenly the best reps are the ones who know how to go fishing in the CRM and find stuff, or they're just off adding a bunch of things, right? And then your next rep that you hire, they're starving because they can't find anything to work because somebody's sitting on 5,000 accounts because they've been there for a couple of years, that type of thing. So when Lily talks about the Wild Wild West, that's kind of the thing that she's referring to, and not the underappreciated Will Smith movie from the late 90s. But that said, that's what you start with. But then there's a point in time, maybe you raise a Series B or something, you hire a sales leader, and then you grow up. Like, we're getting serious about this. And then I think you swing the pendulum too far to the other side because you say, like, okay, we got to be a serious company. So let's go look at our TAM and let's carve up all of that. And we're going to do it in this big planning process. And we're going to say that we're going to take this zip code and this zip code, and we're going to pack those together. And then we're going to calculate our revenue potential based on whatever analysis that we've got. And then suddenly you're creating these boxes, these patches that you then hand to each rep. And you act like they're all equivalent to each other, but they're really not in many cases. Somebody gets Northern California, somebody gets Northern Arkansas. Those two things aren't necessarily equivalent, but that's a little bit insidious with what happens because, that person in Northern Arkansas probably could use more opportunity, but that person in Northern California, they're probably sitting on more opportunity than they can effectively work. So you're kind of giving yourself this double whammy of like, we're not working accounts we could be, and we're overworking accounts that probably aren't that great. So I think when you try to grow up, that is a really interesting inflection point where you try to put this structure in place and you end up over structuring things and creating these kind of pockets of inefficiency that we think of as best practice. Like, I don't know how many times I've been in a conversation with somebody who's maybe a little old school thinking about territory and says, well, I want to look my rep in the eye. I don't want to say they're the CEO of their patch, right? And like, okay, sure, but you gave them 1,500 accounts based on revenue potential. They can only really work about 100 accounts at any given point in time, that there's a whole bunch of other accounts that are part of your strategy you want to focus on that are actually in this other territory. And so, like, are you really looking the rep in the eye and making them as successful as possible? And are you making your company as successful as possible? And so I think it's a big set of decisions that come on you pretty quick. And there's just like a toolbox that people reach into that they've reached into for literally the last 100 years. And I think it bears a little more careful consideration.
100%. And we've been on kind of both sides of it with the helping small startups and on the helping large companies get out of a mess that was created. And the number of times that we see the I'm surprised by the lack of thought or intention that went into our TAM design. You know, it was a big sweeping, it was the big planning exercise, and a lot of people put a lot of time and attention into it, but there wasn't really, it was done by committee. There wasn't that one person that said, okay, these are the core pieces. This is how we build the market. This is this. It's like, okay, we can serve anybody and everybody. And as somebody who's run a demand gen agency for 12 years, I've seen a lot of companies come in and have varying degrees of honesty with themselves about where they can and cannot be successful, and that can have a huge impact too. I think I'm going to step down off my soapbox because that's probably a little bit of a distraction, and we'll throw, if you're interested, I'll throw a couple links to conversations we've had about this in the show notes. But before we get into the right way, can we talk about all the ways? And Lily, I'd love if you could kind of enlighten us on, you know, like what are all the different ways? And we've kind of hit on a couple of them. But just so we do our diligence there.
Yeah, for sure. And so we usually break it down from a perspective of like static model versus dynamic model territory designs. And so as the name insinuates, static means it stays the same. And most of the time these are the most commonly known ones that Hayes was mentioning, where it's like, you do the geographic carving once a year and you give a rep like 5,000 accounts and say, go at it. And that doesn't change for the entire year, or maybe it's a mid-year change. And so pretty static. That's one model. Another model is the vertical aspects. So, hey, you get all the fintech companies and you get all the retail companies, and that's yours forever. As long as you want to, as long as you continue working them. And then the named accounts model. So, hey, we have, X amount of accounts that we want this rep to work for the entire year. They're going to get these and that's it. Right. And so they carve up what they believe are good ICP fits for their team to go after to hit their revenue targets. The other side of that, from the static model, which is the dynamic model, one of them is like the round robin based, where we're round robining these accounts based on, several different factors that you may have, whether it's, inbounds or intent. And then also having kind of like a wild, wild west motion where reps may take accounts, and decide they want to work them and then end up sitting on them sometimes and waiting for them to inbound. And then the other model is the dynamic books model, which really encompasses a view of like, how do we actually get our reps to work the accounts that we deem as high ICP fit based on their capacity to actually work those accounts versus giving them too many accounts that they can't realistically focus and spend a lot of time and losing a lot of efficiency and actually converting those accounts work into opportunities.
And this is where the technical background comes, because effectively it's like a load balancing algorithm mechanism.
Yeah, it is. And, one of the things that we've found is that when we talk to folks about the idea of dynamic books is that, many people have tried some level of dynamic approach in their territory design. And often the first thing on people's minds is basically round robin, right? Like we've done like a round robin distribution, which kind of breaks down if you're not heavily inbound and if you're not, and once you get to a certain size. So
it's the lottery model.
Yeah. And so one of the things that it's a lottery that should be fair over time, but doesn't always feel that way.
Yeah.
But so one of the things that we found is that, people often kind of have this feeling that like, something about the territory model, the way we've always done it with like static patches and stuff, we know there's something non-optimal about it, but it's like kind of the only way, right? That really sort of scales. And so what we found is that it's really helpful to walk people through a sort of a holistic view of how dynamic books works, and then compare and contrast that a little bit to maybe how the static model works. And so if I could share that, I think it'll sort of put all the pieces together, and then we can kind of come back to what Lily shared about static versus dynamic and kind of talk about, there is no silver bullet. There's one of my favorite phrases from a mentor of mine is, there's no silver bullet. There's just lots of lead bullets, which I really like in many cases, right? And so there's no silver bullet. There is no one design necessarily that works in all cases. And I think it's good to have a good evaluation of that. But let me share a little bit more about how the dynamic books model works, and then we can come back to the different ways that it compares and contrasts.
Cool.
If that makes sense for you, Collin. Yeah. So think about it this way. Most of the time in a static model, when you go to you do a once a year carve, right? I carve up a patch of accounts, and then that's a reps patch for that entire year. And that's an attempt at some kind of a load balancing approach, right? But it happens very slowly. And it happens in a way where you're doing it in this high stakes carve where you don't really have all the information that you might need, and things change throughout the year, especially if you're a relatively early stage. So what we do in this model is imagine that you've got 10 reps, and I'll use 10 just to keep my math easy here while I'm talking. Typically, if you actually do the math and you look at it, 10 reps, maybe they're mid-market reps, they can really only work about 100 accounts each at any given point in time. And that's not a hard and fast number, but if you actually sit down and you analyze the work that your reps are doing, all the tasks and activities they're doing, the total number of accounts they're meaningfully engaging with over the course of, say, a month, a lot of times we've seen, because we do this analysis for a lot of folks, that a mid-market rep is probably around 100. Plus, it's easier for my math if I use 100 and then 10, right? So what that tells us is that at any given moment in time, this team we're talking about can really only effectively be working about 1,000 accounts, 100 accounts each for 10 reps. So what we do in this model is we say, let's stack rank all the accounts that we've got in our TAM. Let's take everything we've got in Salesforce, and let's make sure that we're looking at our firmographics, we're looking at any intent signals, all of those things, and let's stack rank those. So maybe we've got 10,000 accounts in our Salesforce. So if we stack rank all of them, we could take, and we ignore geography, we could take the 1,000 best accounts and hand those out to those reps right then and there. Ignore geography, ignore vertical. Those other 9,000 accounts, they'll stay in what we call a ready pool, and marketing can nurture those. You can be working on those from a demand gen perspective and kind of an account-based marketing type perspective. And then your 1,000 accounts that are in the hands of the reps, well, each of those reps are going to start working on them. And a good rep's going to do one of two things. They're going to turn that account into a customer, or if they're an SDR, they're going to set a meeting. Or, and this is key, especially this time of year, they're going to learn something. They're going to need to disposition that account. They're going to learn that, account is out of business. They've been acquired. They're under contract with a competitor for the next 18 months. These are things that reps learn on an ongoing basis. And in a static territory model, you kind of force your reps to just set those accounts aside, right? Like they sort of put them aside, make a note to themselves, whatever. Lord knows they're probably not putting that information in the CRM because there's no incentive to, right? And then
it's the hardest opportunity to follow down, to chase down.
It is.
Right? Like I spent a bunch of time in outbound, and it is the biggest waste of money that companies spend on their demand gen is you meet a company that you spend all this time, whether it's inbound, ads, outbound, to generate somebody who clicks a button and wants to talk to a rep, and they have a conversation, and the rep goes, project not in the next 90 days, they're not in my pipeline.
Right.
And then that opportunity goes into your CRM to die.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, conversely, right? So you've got that scenario. You've also got a scenario where a rep builds some value, but there's just no real way to move forward at some point, right? Maybe it's not 90 days. Maybe it's that, contract with a competitor, those types of things, right? But long story short is that is crucial information. Like whether it's, good information or bad information is key information about the state of that account. And so what you do in this model is instead of having the rep kind of sit that off to the side, you actually encourage them to actively disposition that account to do what we call a return, to put it back in the pool with a clear ROE. And we could talk about ROE for an entire other podcast, but like clear ROE, clear definitions, but they put that back in the pool and they give a reason for that return. And so
what does ROE stand for?
Rules of engagement. Yeah. Rules of engagement.
Thanks.
So, so that's a really important term. Something you'll need to think about as you start to build out territories in general, because you got to decide when can somebody work something and when they can't. So as they do this process, those 100 accounts that they have in their name, they it goes down to 95 or 90. And so what do you do next? Well, you take those stack ranked accounts, you re-rank them based on any additional signals, and you proactively distribute those to the reps to bring them back up to 100. And so you can kind of imagine in your head, you've got this nice little loop where reps get the next best set of accounts. They're working those accounts. They're dispositioning some of them, turning some into customers, and they get more accounts. And, the two other aspects to it that usually get integrated are, you need to think about what happens when reps aren't actively working accounts. And most companies implement a use or lose it type model here. Remember, you're giving the best accounts out to reps. These are the top 1,000 for your business. You want to make sure they're all being worked. If, somebody's not working those accounts, they can be redistributed.
Yeah. No sales
dragons not working it.
I'm like an old crusty old dragon, and I just want all of my accounts, and I want to sit on them and hold them.
Yes.
I'm going to get angry if anybody tries to take away. And I'd like to think I breathe fire, but I can't even fly. So
yeah, that is certainly a persona that we encounter on occasion. And then the last piece is, look, one of the big lessons I learned in my previous role was the whole job to be done here isn't just to figure out territory and then figure out inbound and kind of look at those things separately. It's all about using your quota capacity and using your reps as effectively as possible. So you want to integrate inbound into this. You want to think about hand raisers. You want to think about signals. But instead of just a pure round robin, or instead of let me look up their HQ and decide which territory it goes to, you actually want to get those accounts in the hands of the reps that have capacity to take them and work them. And so that's really how this model works. And the key kind of thing with this is that you have this ability to, over time, adjust. It's dynamic. So if you want to run different plays during the year, or you have certain kinds of accounts you want to target in different ways, like as you're doing those distributions, you distribute accounts like that out to your reps. And so the concentration of those accounts you want reps focus on increases over time, just naturally. And so it's a much more agile way of running your team that doesn't descend into the chaos of a pure round robin or wild, wild west. So that's just to give you a sense of kind of how that works. But that process of having an active working set of accounts, being able to return accounts, proactively distributing accounts, and then integrating all those pieces together, that's when we really start to see the model shine and be successful for lots of folks.
Totally. Okay. I have lots of questions here. Obviously, we'll kind of get to dynamic books is a methodology we'll get to kind of what GradientWorks does in a bit, but I want to talk about sort of how do we get into this, if we think about the steps, how am I picking and sorting? Like, I think before you started this company, Lily, what were you doing to pick and sort your accounts? How do you decide on which accounts to get in there? And then how do you kind of figure out what that right number is for a rep?
Yeah, it was a very painstaking process, not going to lie, and had done it very manually in spreadsheets, which is probably something that a lot of the listeners may feel the pain as well. But was pretty much looking at like our ICP fit criteria. Like typically that was our employee counts, general company size, and then also like ARR, and then locations as well, for what we were looking for. And then taking all the accounts we had and then trying to understand like how many of these actually meet the criteria, and then doing another analysis to figure out, okay, what are the factors that don't meet our ICP criteria then, and making sure that we apply that to our segmentation and take those accounts out, and then really just honing in on what do we want our reps to be focusing on. Like if they outbound into this account with relevant messaging, this will actually convert, right? And turn into an opportunity for us. So that's the lens that I would work on. And it would be in conjunction with our ops manager as well. And so, one of the other things is like when you do things in spreadsheets, there's always a constant fear of like, are we going to lose some of this data going back and forth with each other as well? And like, how are you going to communicate effectively around like, is this what you want to be like distribute to the reps, like doesn't meet this criteria. So that's typically what like the process was for us, and just understanding like what's our product, who does it support, who are our clients that are, renewing clients that we and what are the prospect accounts that are similar to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're doing a profile based on your current existing accounts, and then you're trying to bring in new data from other sources into the sheet, and then you've got some sort of sorting or scoring mechanism in the sheet.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Okay. I'm just trying to walk through the process of like how did we do it manually? So start with ICP, kind of enrich, add other data, and then you've got your master algorithm in a sheet that's helping you sort and prioritize, and then you can kind of rerun that, at whatever cadence makes a lot of sense. When you're doing this manually, how frequently would you do it? Daily sounds like insane. Weekly is probably still too frequently. Monthly, quarterly, maybe?
Yeah. For a while, initially I was doing it monthly, and it was pretty much almost an all day thing to do. And
how many reps? How many reps? How many accounts?
Yeah, this was for the 50 SDRs, and I was also doing it for the AEs, for a specific subset of AEs on the software side. And so it was a lot of work. And outside of that, then I have to send it over to our ops person to actually do all the updates and, double check the criteria and whatnot. So it took a lot of time, but then also like making sure we're understanding like our reps actually working their books that we've given them, their account books, like what have they not touched, and then also calculating what realistically they need to be getting in the next distribution was a big part of that process. And so we do like a 3-month look back of like accounts worked across each team, each rep, what was the actual conversion rate to opportunity, and in regards to like revenue generated, how much did we actually bring in?
And what were the criteria? Like, I guess what I'm trying to understand is like, say I got a list of, I'm a rep, I've got 100 accounts. Is there a rough percentage that you're targeting to cycle in and out? Or is it based on like, if I touch 80 of them, then 20 are going to get out. Or if I touch 40 of them, I'm going to lose the ones I didn't touch. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, good question. So we did some calculations, and, we were able to say like, hey, realistically, my SDRs can work about, just to keep them that simple, 100 accounts, right? And so my goal was our reps should be at least touching 80% of these accounts. And a touch means some type of email, call, social activity like LinkedIn or whatnot, activity done on the account within the last 30 days for that to be considered an actively worked account. And so the flip side of that was if accounts weren't meeting that criteria, then we would implement this use it or lose it model where it was like, hey, you haven't touched this account in 30 days. We're automatically going to put it back into the pool so that someone else can get it. Or we would just look at all the accounts in their name. So they, one common challenge is like reps kind of can hoard accounts. And so to experience that directly where I've seen a colleague where they had really great companies like ICP fit companies. And so, but they weren't actually working them, which is a huge market miss for the company, but also for me, who I'm like, I actually want to work this account and get a deal out of it. And so one thing that we implemented was like a rule in general saying like, hey, if you haven't touched any account in your name in X amount of days, we should be pulling back, because that means maybe you worked it, but you weren't able to actually break through and get an opportunity. So let's actually diversify the chances of us actually breaking through by letting it nurture, get some marketing campaigns going for that, maybe have them inbound, or redistribute to another rep that actually may be able to break through it in a different way.
And one last nerdy question on the old way. How were you doing that? Were you running a big report at the end? Did you have some more automations that kind of automatically updated the Salesforce account status? Like, I've done the account status approach, and it works. It can be a bit janky, and it takes a little bit of maintenance to keep it going. I'm curious how you all did it.
Ace can probably answer the more technical side of it. To my knowledge, I was like there's a lot of code that was built. It's going to be very hard to change, very hard and very expensive to change that code. So that was the biggest thing in my perspective. It also, like, whenever I did try to change things, I was always met with, yeah, we can't do that right now.
So I think so a couple of things that are interesting as you're doing this process manually. So one of the things that I want to be clear about is, like, it is possible to do a dynamic books process manually. It's also possible and necessary to do this type of stack ranking process that we've been talking about manually. And I'd like to, I'm going to come back to that in a second, because it's the key input, regardless of how you think about doing territory design. I think people tend to overcomplicate that process a little bit, even though it can get very complicated as you scale. But to the standpoint of, like, trying to manage the account lifecycle in Salesforce or something like that, if you're thinking about doing this, one of the key things to know is an account assigned or is an account unassigned, right? And and that sounds very simple, but it's actually can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge for folks, right? Because in many cases, in a static territory model, you're kind of used to every single account being in the hands of a rep, right? So every account is, like, assigned. The owner of the Salesforce record is the account, is the rep. So typically, one of the first things you do is you designate a user in your Salesforce as a pool holding user. So it might be kind of an admin user or something like that. In many cases, people give it clever names, things, that sort of thing. But
Cheryl, your accounts.
Yeah. One of the companies that we work with, a lot of their customer of ours, they call themselves, like, their employees, they call them navigators. And so their particular holding account is Navigator. It's like two first name, last name. But suffice it to say, that's where your pool is. So all the accounts that are not actively being worked by a rep, that are not in their active in their hands, you would typically assign them to this holding user, right? And then what you want to do is, as you move them from the holding user and transfer ownership to a rep as part of a distribution process or an assignment process, is you typically want to stamp those accounts with some information about the reason they were distributed. Like, is it an automated distribution? Was it an inbound? Was it a campaign? Something like that.
That's a good idea.
And then tag those accounts usually with a timestamp for when they were distributed. By the same token, if you want to have a return type process, you'll want to use those types of kind of timestamp and like status as well, to designate, like, why something was returned and that sort of thing, if it goes out of the user's name into the pool user. So, a couple of simple things there that you'll want to have is just, it's very useful to kind of, you want to have that ownership split so you can know sort of whether an account is being, is out and assigned or not. You may want to have, like, an account lifecycle status, so just sort of where they're at. And then you want to capture, as best you can, some information about when and why an account was distributed and when and why an account might have been taken out of somebody's name. And those things become really useful later on. We've since learned that what you really need is an audit trail that's, like, kind of continuous as you go, so that you can go back and see the history. But, like, you can start with just those statuses to kind of manage the life cycle. I may be getting too far into the nerdy weeds here, but I think if you're going to start with this in a manual way, that's one of the things you want to consider.
It is one of the worst parts about Salesforce, is that you have these static fields that would be so helpful if you had field history and you were able to query based on field history. In theory, it makes sense. I understand, make Salesforce a whole lot more complicated, but they do have kind of the field history in there, but you can't build a report or manipulate the data in that way. So it is one of those things where you take something that in theory could be simple, but it just doesn't work that way. Interesting.
Yeah. So it's and you can do many of these same things in HubSpot as well, right? Like with their configuration and their custom fields. Those are a couple of the things to consider if you're thinking about this kind of model. But But if I could go back to the stack ranking piece real quickly, because I think that there's two things that I think people should be thinking about if they're really trying to start to do this for the first time, or really trying to think about how best to again, whether you're doing a static model or not, you got to have some sense of like the value and kind of the relative value of accounts, right? So I think that early on, people make this way too complicated. I think that it's perfectly fine to have a formula in Salesforce that looks at a few attributes of your accounts and assigns kind of like point values to them and does that type of thing. If you're doing that right now and you're cringing and you're thinking like, oh, I really should be doing this in a fancier way, I've seen some very large companies where it all really comes down to like a field, like a formula field in Salesforce doing some, like plus whatever for X, right? So that's an okay place to start. What I would encourage people to think about when they're doing that is a mistake I see people make in that, like, again, I'm getting kind of nerdy here, but a mistake I see people making is trying to cram too much into a single number. And so they're trying to like say like, at any given point in time, I'm going to like incorporate any intent signals and stuff I have, and then I'm going to incorporate firmographic signals and stuff I have, and we're going to put all this stuff together, and I'm going to have some big set of if statements, and then I'm going to get a perfect number that's going to tell me that this is the right account right this moment. That is really hard to make work. I suggest in most cases you separate out a fit score, which is the best assessment you have of like the firmographic attributes of an account and how well they might be an ICP fit, from the timing component, which is whether or not they're showing some sort of signal to be in market. Because, at any given point in time, I see numbers between 10 and 20% of your accounts, probably lower than that right now, are actually in market for your solution. So the vast majority of the time that your reps are going to be spending, if they're doing outbound, is trying to reach good fit accounts where you either have no indication of intent or you have, limited indication that there is any intent there. And so if you kind of have that ability to separate those two axes and say, I'm going to focus on high firmographic accounts always, and then if possible, I'm also going to be focused on the ones that are high firmographics, but also intent, you get yourself into a place where you can kind of manage that process better. But if you try to lump all that into one thing, it can be pretty challenging. So that's my kind of thesis. And thank you for coming to my TED Talk about account scoring, but that's kind of how I see it.
I love it because I think when you do it that way, you can still roll it up to a bigger number, but then you can implement the numbers differently, right? Yeah. Like if you think about on the fit side of things, on the firmographic fit, you could have tiers, 1 through 5, right? And then on the timing side of things, you could have the same thing. And then you could have it roll up where I do think there's value in prioritizing something that's higher priority, but lower on the fit scale. Mm-hmm. And I'm drawing a blank on his name. I could see his face and I remember the conversation we had, but it was like a month or two ago in podcast time, but it was probably 3 to 4 months ago. I recorded it in Collin time. But we talked about, I'll find a link and I'll throw it in the show notes, how they do their like 8 different levels. And it was a version of this. I do think they had ultimately rolled up to one field in Salesforce. Maybe I'll make an intro for you after this. Because anyway, I love how you're approaching it that way. I'm curious, so much of this, and I kind of said it, I wasn't going to touch on it, but I do feel like it's an important piece. Are you doing anything fancy to get these accounts in the first place, right? Like there isn't always, it sounds like you're working with intent data. I imagine you're working with all the standard, data providers. Are there ever any instances where you're like, hey, you know what, it would be great if we could have kind of this signal or that signal? Because it's not always, my perfect account is not always, this geography, this many, this, it can be a little bit more dynamic than that. How do you think about those kinds of signals?
So I want to I want to make sure I answer this question without sounding like I'm talking about our exact solution, because we do have a way of thinking about this. So I'll share with you the way that I think about this and the most important signal that I think is really underutilized. So I'll just make a statement that I certainly believe to be true, and I've seen to be true, that for companies that are reasonably mature, like, you're not just starting out, but you've been in business for a little bit. Your next customer is probably already in your CRM. You may or may not have good data about it, but it's probably already there. It's probably not showing intent because most accounts are not. And as a, kind of a final thing here is it's probably going to look like customers you've already closed, right? Like this is not rocket science, right? So I'm probably not saying anything that anybody would like vehemently disagree with. But if you take those things as a given, then that leads me to something that I've seen all the best reps that I've ever worked with do, which is they pay attention when there's a case study that comes out from product marketing, or they pay attention when they see an announcement in the Gong channel in Slack where there's a new customer that's closed, even if it wasn't them, right? And then they'll talk to CS and they'll go learn about use cases. And then what do? They look in their territory or their book or whatever, and they find those accounts that are in the same space, right? We just closed an account that does, I don't know, PCI compliance, right? Well, what other accounts in my patch, whatever I'm working from, also do that? Because I can tell them that story. Maybe I can't reference that client, but I can tell them that story. And so it's just something that good reps do. They actually pay attention to those things and they focus on it. And so I think the most underused signal is really trying in some way to understand across your Salesforce or your CRM or your account base, which accounts are like each other in terms of what they do and what markets they serve. And I know this sounds like industry, but industry typically doesn't really give you that story very well, because I get my NAICS code or whatever, and I'm like, fantastic, these two things are manufacturers, right? But I can't tell a story about that. But man, if we sold like the world's number one like copper pipe fitting company, right? Then like I should be able to know the world number two copper pipe fitting company and go sell to them. And so I think really being able to look at that as a signal, how do I go tell a story from a customer that we've closed to somebody else and do it in a way that they're going to immediately resonate with that story because it's so similar to what they're dealing with. I think that's a key thing that is tough to solve. It's tough to solve without AI. We've gone this long in this podcast and no one said AI, so I felt really necessary. I'm proud of myself for going this long. But I think it's something that we need to do because it's replicating the things that the best reps do. And I think we have a solution for thinking about the problem this way, but I think it's the thing that I've seen be just one of the most successful, just bread and butter sales tactics. And the more you can scale that out and work with that, the better.
Love it. I think it's a natural point to jump in because I am curious. What is this thing that you all do within GradientWorks? So now we're transitioning from dynamic books, the methodology, to paid programming. I mean, not really paid programming because you didn't pay to be here.
That's true.
Great if you would, but this is
you can send us a bill afterwards. That's fine.
Ooh, great. $1 just to say.
Yeah. All right.
Tell me about how does this work in GradientWorks?
So look, when you think about the idea of how you want to do territory, or to think about how you're assigning accounts, to think about how you're going to do this better, the whole purpose of all of this is to drive more efficiency and effectiveness, especially around outbound. How do I generate more pipeline by covering the right accounts? And so for us with GradientWorks, it really comes down to three things. Account selection. We have an AI capability to help you do the use case I just described. So I think it's very, very valuable to be able to understand which of our prospects out there are very, very similar to our existing customers. So our market map capability, which is part of our account selection kind of pillar, if you will, helps you find customer lookalikes within your universe of prospects. And then that flows into what we think of as our second pillar, which is account assignment. So we have our account selection and then account assignment. Within that, we have what we call book builder, which everything we talked about with dynamic books, this kind of replacement for how you think about territory and how you turn it into a more dynamic capacity, capped approach. That's all embodied in book builder. We then have routing capabilities built around that. And so similar to, everyone's favorite routing tools that are out there, but these integrate with this holistic assignment approach. And then the last piece, which we really haven't talked about, though Lily touched on it a little bit, is around accountability. There's a different kind of accountability model for reps in this motion where it's not about activity, it's about coverage. And so that necessitates sometimes some different analytics about where reps are spending their time and which accounts are being covered, both to help you shape which accounts you want to put in their hands, as well as to just enforce the types of good productive behaviors that you want to see from the reps. So account selection, account assignment, and accountability, all in the service of driving more pipeline by covering the right accounts. And that's what GradingWorks does.
Love it. If people are interested in learning more, what's the best place for them to go have a look?
Gradient.works. So we've got one of those neat, different top level domains. So yeah, Gradient.works. And look, we spend a lot of our time educating people on the dynamic books model. We believe in it really, really strongly. We've had a lot of customers be very successful with it. So there's a ton of resources there, all ungated. Just go learn about the model, work on it yourself. And if you get to a place where you feel like there's a challenge and you can't make progress, we're here to help. If you want to do better prioritization, if you want to manage a more scaled out process, then that's where GradientWorks comes into play.
Love it. I've got maybe an action item for one of you. If you could send me kind of your favorite piece of educational content on dynamic books, I'll throw it in the show notes just to make it easy for people to not have to Google around.
Has to be happy to.
I love it. That's kind of the episode. I do have one question that I wanted to ask, given you've been in the CRM space for a while. Salesforce is arguably, or I don't know if anybody would argue, is the kind of dominant leader in the CRM world. And so I just have this is a personally self-serving question that I'm interested in. What do you think it would take for Salesforce to lose their dominant position as market leader? And this is not something I think is going to happen next year or even going to happen, period. But let's fast forward 20 years. What are the things that would have to happen for Salesforce to lose that dominant position?
Lily, do you have thoughts on that? I guess I've got a couple, but I want to make sure. I've been talking for a while.
Yeah. 20 years. That is a great question. Why don't you come back to me on that? Let me think on it, since it sounds like Hayes already has a few things in mind, but so I'll hand the torch over to him.
So, Salesforce has about 150,000 customers, right? And the reason they're like the pinnacle of what people think about when they think about the SaaS business model is because there's only so many SaaS products that come along that have just absolutely mind-boggling retention characteristics. And CRM is one of those, because you built yourself a source of truth. You built yourself a large surface area in terms of seats. You built yourself a system of process. So you've got system of record, system of process, all of those things. It's very hard to rip out, right? So what would have to happen, I think what would have to be true for Salesforce to fundamentally lose their dominance is a little of what's happening now. They have to, that 150,000 kind of maybe starts to flatline and organically decline a little bit just through natural attrition. There's not going to be a lot, I don't think there's a material amount of those people that rip it out and go with something else, right? So those companies have to kind of die, sort of a generational thing, right? It's I don't know, political viewpoints and stuff. You just kind of have to have a generation sort of disappear over time, right? I'm not going to go any farther into that, but and then a younger generation needs to adopt something new, and then they need to start to grow, right? And so I think we see that with HubSpot primarily, I think. And so I think it's almost like demographics, company demographics. There's a trend that HubSpot is growing faster, a more young, a more youthful country. People are having more babies, right? They're getting bigger and bigger, right? And then you've got the kind of older country that's slowly declining a little bit. And so, even in 20 years, if you project out the demographics, I'm not sure that puts Salesforce in a non-leadership position, but it puts them in parity. So I'll preface all of that by saying, I am not a SaaS demographer, and I also don't know anything in particular about that, but just the law of large numbers and the retention characteristics seem like it's hard for that to decline precipitously for Salesforce.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying, Hayes, to your like point, it resonates a lot because the sales leaders I talk to that decide to go with a different CRM, in the end, that's not Salesforce. And I ask them, hey, why go this route? Because a lot of our experiences as sellers ourselves has been living and working out of the Salesforce environment. And I think it's usually the common scenarios are like, oh, we just want something flexible, like very, very flexible that we can mold. And we have an opportunity to do that with, this up and coming CRM solution. And so I think that's the common feedback that kind of ties into what Hayes is saying is like potentially generational, and also maybe a shift in like how people are building their go-to-market teams and how they want their tech stack to fit that mold versus fitting into an existing tech mold.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on either side. I think for a big change like that to happen, there's got to be a 10x somewhere in terms of like it's 10x cheaper, it's 10x better. Chances are, if you're selling into the CRM market, it's going to be a 10x better. I don't think your CFO at a big company is going to be like, oh, this is 10x cheaper, so we're going to save 0.00001 of our expenses to risk ripping out the system of record and system of process. So I think it's going to have to be a 10x improvement on the ability to do something. I'm always curious when I meet people that are think deeply in the space what their perspectives are. So thank you for.
You piqued my interest there. There's one thing I left out, which is like some fundamental shift in how people view like what a CRM even is. And there's this little kind of nascent group of folks, I think, who are thinking about maybe sort of decomposing the CRM into like most of their sales data and stuff is in Redshift or like a data warehouse. And then they kind of build things on top of that. And I don't know where that goes, but if there was a point where people say, look, a CRM is not the monolith that we've been led to believe, since, Benioff showed up with his no software buttons, right? Like, I think that could be a time where things change, where it's just like some kind of innovation that says like, oh, it doesn't look like that anymore. Could be a way that changes.
I've always thought of Salesforce as like cloud Oracle, and I think they are. What I mean by that is they are a SaaS, easy to use GUI on top of the database, and so
it is literally under the hood Oracle. By the way, if you break Salesforce in the right way, you can actually see an Oracle error pop up. I've done it.
That's that's an honor I have not achieved myself. Jackson
so much. Yeah.
But if you think about Salesforce as a GUI to a database that a whole bunch of Salesforce admin folks know how to use, then I think it kind of changes the model perspective, and you can start to see as tech and code becomes easier to manipulate with just language, then you could see a version of this heading in that direction.
Yeah. I agree.
Thank you for indulging. That was really, that was super interesting. Thank you both for coming on the show. If people are looking to get in touch, they want to reach out, connect with you, what's the best way?
I'm Hayes, Hayes, at gradient.works. Send me an email or find me on LinkedIn.
Yep. And I'm Lily, Lily, at gradient.works.
Right on. Well, thank you both for coming on the show. I'll make sure we get your LinkedIn's in the show notes as well. And thank you again.
What?
Having us.
Right on. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll catch y'all next week.